Welcome everyone to The Sheriff is in Town, Permissions and Security in Dynamics 365 Business Central. We're going to cover a lot today in a short period of time. We're going to talk about fraud in small business, but not just about what it is, but what you can do to keep it from happening to your organization and why it's so important and why it's often overlooked in small businesses, as well as detailed steps to make it easier for you to put permissions in place in Business Central. I'm Cynthia Priebe. I'm a senior trainer and consultant with NewView Strategies, and I absolutely love the fact that I get to work with frustrated users of Business Central and figure out the best way, or what I like to say is the righter way to do things in Business Central to not only make their job easier, but to improve their utilization of Business Central so that it can make them as well as their companies more successful. I'm joined today by Kim Congleton. Kim, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Hi, I'm Kim Congleton, and I'm the COO of NewView Strategies. And like Cynthia, I really enjoy working with frustrated users to help them figure out how they can do more, especially in the areas of warehousing, inventory management, and like we're going to talk about today, some of the permissions areas and security.
So Kim, you and I might be two of the only people that like to talk about permissions and security. I think most people just kind of like shove it under the rug, right?
Speaking of, so we all have been there and done that. And I think this is, to your point, Cynthia, both of us have spent hours and hours doing security and permission. So, and we're talking back in the days when there wasn't the permissions recorder, all those fancy add-ons for permissions. So the tips you're going to get today and what you're going to hear from us today is our real world experience.
Yeah. And I want to actually start with a story that really, I mean, this is true. It was my first experience with working with a company where they had somebody embezzle money. And in this case, they embezzled $200,000. And it was a small organization with a lot of employees with cross functions. And the person that did the embezzling was actually referred to work there by another highly valued employee. She was so well liked. Everybody called her mom. She brought cookies in every Friday. She was just very well liked and very well trusted. And as they were uncovering some discrepancies in the books, they found out that she had, over a period of about 18 months, after having been there about 2 years, embezzled $200,000. And they were incredulous that it could even happen. Part of the challenge was that there wasn't a lot of oversight because, again, everybody was somewhat like family. And this person, it wasn't actually their first time. Their prior two positions, they had embezzled some money. It was smaller amounts. They were let go. No criminal charges were filed, and it was just kept very, very quiet. So it was kind of a sad situation. Well, so what can you do so that you're not one of those small businesses that's dealing with that fraud?
Yeah, and I think, definitely one of the things is that a lot of people talk about, especially when you start talking about security and permissions and audits, is the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Especially if you're a public corporation, this does cover what you need to do. But when you're a private corporation, and I've worked at a lot of private corporations where this is not what you have to do. You don't have to meet these standards. There's no mandate for you to meet these standards. But a lot of the small businesses I've worked with, they've said, if I'm going to do an audit, if I'm going to do securities and permissions, I want to do it like I'm a public company and treat it as if I had to pass that. And I think it's a smart thing to do. I don't know, Cynthia, what have you seen in your experience?
I've actually seen kind of the opposite, where they know they need to do something, but I don't think that they know where to start. So, Kim, is the information on Sarbanes-Oxley readily available? I mean, so that you could know what those standards are?
Yeah, I mean, and I think we have some information at the end with some resources, but you can go out there and Google it, and it's readily available on the government sites where you can read about it. But I think it is, it's interesting because if you're a smaller business, I feel like you have the experience like you've had. If it's a business that's maybe more on the medium side,
Yeah.
I have there's a tendency to want to do more towards meeting those SOX mandates.
Yeah, I think it also depends on where the management is coming from.
Yeah.
I've noticed that when it's a small business where management might have come from larger business, it's just a mindset. If it's a small business, it's worked up from a mom and pop to maybe getting close to a middle-sized business. So it's kind of where you're coming from, which you're going to see as we talk through today, some of these different areas that you need to look at. It makes you realize that it's not just one department that needs to think about security and or fraud prevention. You have to look at it from a whole organization, but I really think it needs to be from the top down, that mindset.
Yeah, exactly.
So you could have this running wild situation, right? Some of these smaller businesses. And part of the concern is that theft is what makes up the majority of fraudulent activity. And it's just stealing cash, even out of the petty cash drawer, or filing bogus expense reports, right? Because there's no double check for that. Or financial reports are juggled. One of the things that some consultants find amazing is that the head of finance will say, well, I have to have these reports generated out of Business Central. And we'll be, oh, well, you can put it into Excel. No, Excel can be modified. I want something that's system generated that's a printed report because that can't be modified. So little things like that where somebody takes the financials out of the system, puts them into Excel, and maybe changes some numbers to make them work for what they're trying to relay, that's easy to do if you don't have double checks and balances in place. And smaller businesses are at higher risk because of that, because you have employees that perform multiple functions. Whoever is receiving the cash might be the person who's also generating the financial statements. You see a possible problem there. And like I told you in that scenario I was talking about, this woman was called mom. So you feel guilty double checking on somebody you like. No, you have to do that. It's part of your job. So the smaller companies, they don't feel comfortable. We call them mom. Everybody has cross functions. Everything's less formal. And by the way, you might have employees that started out on the reception desk and moved up to accounts payable. Good for them. That's wonderful. But what kind of formal training do they have? Sometimes things happen just because people don't know any better. So we need to look at all of these things because it might not be $200,000. Even $5,000 can mean a lot to the cash flow of a small business. So when we look at fraud by the numbers, it even gets scarier. Interestingly enough, typically the fraud that occurs and gets caught is the person's first offense. Now, I don't know if that means because the serial fraud people know how to move on and not get caught, or if it's that people aren't that great at it, or that companies have some fraud prevention in place. So they were able to get away with it for a while and then get caught, but they're usually first-time offenders. So maybe it was just a crime of opportunity. On average, it takes 18 months to detect it. And then the average loss is around 140,000. So you can see where the customer I was working with, unfortunately, they were above average with that $200,000 missing. But these are pretty scary numbers. So what can we do? What steps can we take to prevent that? Kim, can you help us there?
So there are a number of things we can do pretty easily to kind of start building in some checks and balances. So one of the first things we can do is the segregate accounting duties. Like almost everywhere we go in, especially if it's a small business, there's going to be one or two people, if not the whole accounting department, that can create a new vendor, enter a purchase invoice, and cut a check. And so that's a great opportunity for fraud to happen. So what you want to do is actually build in some internal controls. So making sure that you're reviewing which vendors, new vendors that get set up. So, either on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis at least, making sure that if one person is setting up the vendors, somebody else is approving or reviewing the vendors that got set up. So they can see if there's any type of irregularities that happen. I struggle with that word all the time.
Say that 3 times fast.
Right, exactly. So it's making sure that you have those internal controls and that you actually are following those each month or quarter, however you set those up to be. The other thing that you can do is also, and I think this is an important one, and you've mentioned this before, Cynthia, scrutinizing the business bank accounts. Like, anybody can print out a Excel spreadsheet, and this kind of goes to what you were saying before earlier. You can also modify an Excel spreadsheet. So making sure that if somebody is giving you a spreadsheet with where your bank accounts are at, that you're also logging into that bank account to make sure that those things are lining up, and you're making sure there's not anything weird like, oh, where's this $10,000 that isn't on the spreadsheet but got taken out of my bank account?
I'll tell you what, when I share that one with people, they get kind of a sick look on their face because they realize they've been relying on these Excel spreadsheets that could be modified and never really thought about it. So I don't mean to make people feel bad, but it's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so important. It's an important point, especially because a lot of accounting departments run by spreadsheets, right? Because, and I don't think it's always somebody's intent to do something bad, but it's like there's now that opportunity that I could. And then the next point is, making sure you're auditing the books regularly. So internally have a process to be looking at that and checking on it. The next thing, I can't tell you how many times we've gone into different places and somebody's got a Post-it note on their desk with the credit card number and the bank number. And it's like, really? Maybe there's not a lot of traffic in this office, but let's not do that. And again, minimizing temptation. And I think all the steps before this is part of this, right? Making sure that if there's processes in place, and making sure that your people are following those. And I also think it's good to mix things up every once in a while, so maybe you audit the books, twice in 1 month instead of once a month, make sure that you're not doing this routine that somebody can also kind of say, oh, well, I know they're not going to check this until now. So maybe I borrow a little bit of money and maybe I put it back before they audit the books. I don't know.
Very good point. Yeah.
Yep. So, and then providing continuous training, and promoting ongoing improvement, anywhere where you can automate things, where you're not relying on a person or Excel, making sure that that's happening. And probably the biggest one, making employees take vacation, because I've heard of a lot of fraud where, hey, this lady didn't take vacation for like 20 years. And then all of a sudden the time she does is when they find out she's, embezzled like $300,000.
Right.
So I think that's a really good point.
So I want to make another point about the continuous training and ongoing improvement. If employees know that you're always paying attention to what is happening in the organization at all levels for the purpose of making sure that what you're doing is the most efficient and most effective, it's another kind of looking over the shoulder kind of thing without really looking over the shoulder. They know that you are constantly monitoring. So when something's being monitored, it's less likely to be tampered with. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to have training and then not have training, or you can't just talk to continuous improvement. You actually have to be doing it. And I bet you if there were some statistics out there somewhere, I haven't found them yet, I haven't really gone looking, but I bet organizations who are focused on that probably have less fraud just because they're always interacting with everyone and always looking for ways to do things better and always looking at how people are doing things. Oh, gee, paying attention.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think visibility is a huge thing.
It is, it is. And I think that kind of goes into this next slide here, where we talk about, we kind of call it the strong sheriff, but those strong controls or that strong presence really helps keep that fraud away. And where do you begin? You need to understand your master data and what needs to be secure and what should be visible to anyone and everyone and what should be locked down, and understand how permissions are set up in the system so that you don't think you have permissions in place and then you find out that everybody's set up as a super user, so you don't have permissions in place. You need to understand how that all works, and you need to look at it and say, all right, I have different people in the organization, they have different roles, and their permissions should be different. Don't say, okay, well, I'm going to have everybody locked down to this level, that's enough, because it's probably not enough. And then how do you take and look at records or look at information in the system that can't be locked down, that should be able to be changed, but you want to know when it is changed? And then how do you even begin to implement all of this, right? You figure out what you need to do. How do you go about implementing it? So let's talk about that a little bit. Let's look at permissions in Business Central. That's really the place that we start. All right, so what we are able to do in Business Central is we are able to secure particular objects. In other words, we can allow somebody to get to the vendor record, or we can allow somebody to not get to the vendor record, or we can allow somebody to view the vendor record but not change it. We can allow people different levels of permission based on their roles, or in other words, what their job is. Now, we do that primarily by table data, and that's where we get that ability to read, ability to insert, ability to modify, or ability to delete. And then we have a lot of other permissions available to us, or objects that we can assign permissions to, and like tables and reports and code units. I'm not going to get into all of the names, but when it comes to those, it's really, is the person allowed to do anything with these objects? So am I allowed to see the vendor? Am I allowed to run a report, or am I allowed to execute a report? Am I allowed to see a sales order? Am I allowed to post an invoice from it? And that would be a code unit. So it can be really confusing. It can be daunting. It's, okay, where do I put these permissions in place? How do I put these permissions in place? Well, what we do is we create permission sets. And permission sets are collections of permissions, of securable objects. So for example, I might have one object in a permission set that has something to do with, let's use the example of updating a vendor record. So the object would be the vendor. And if I'm allowed to modify a vendor record, then my object would be the vendor, and I would give the person modify permissions. If I wanted them to be able to run an aged payables report, the object would be that report, and they would get execute permissions. So now I've talked about two different objects, the ability to modify a vendor and the ability to run a report. Both of those might go in the same permission set, and that permission set is the AP person. Now, why would the AP person need to modify the vendor record? Because maybe they need to change the payment terms on the vendor record. Now, unfortunately, in Business Central out of the box, we're not able to give someone access to the record, but limit them only to certain fields. So we don't have what they call field level security. There are some ISV solutions out there for Business Central. There's one by eFocus. It's called Advanced Security. That's really great. There's Easy Security if you're still working in Nav. And this allows you to get to the field level, but we're concentrating on standard functionality right now. So when it comes to permission sets, I can give different levels of permissions on objects, whether it's a read, insert, modify, delete, or whether they're allowed to run or execute it. And I can combine those into a permission set. Now, we're very lucky in that, or maybe not, I have mixed emotions about this, that Microsoft has given us 74, and it might be more than that now, permission sets out of the box. Wow, is that amazing? There are 74 of them. Well, guess what? Most of them are completely useless because they're too broad. They're not finite enough. So for example, here, I have an accounts payable permission set. In my organization, do I really want my accounts payable person to be able to delete a sales document? delete a sales invoice, delete a sales order. What the heck? Why would an accounts payable person have those permissions? Well, maybe you're doing drop ships and that type of thing, so it matters. But in most organizations, the accounts payable person has no business going into the sales orders. What about the general journal lines? In here, we have permission to go into the general journal and go to a journal entry that's waiting to be posted and delete it. Do I really want my accounts payable person to have those permissions? So as wonderful as it seems that there are 74 permission sets given to us, most of them are not going to be usable. Now, I have all these permission sets. I know they're not usable. So I need to figure out what I'm going to do, how I'm going to create my own. And why do I need to create permission sets? Why do I need to create my own? And that's because what I need to do is I need to define those permission sets, which are collections of objects that I've given permission to, and put them into user groups. And user groups are collections of permission sets. So I might create user groups based on a role in my organization. I could create it based on a title. I might have one person in a user group. I'll explain to you a little bit later here why that would be worthwhile doing. But I might have purchasing, and I have 3 people in purchasing. So purchasing is a user group. I might have accounts payable and accounts receivable, or maybe I have an AP AR person. I still might create an AP user group and an AR user group. I can actually assign more than one user group to a person. But think of them as collections. So again, permission sets are collections of permissions, and user groups are collections of permission sets. And I can assign more than one user group to a user. And I really don't think you can have too many user groups or too many permission sets. If anything, I think you can have too few. So how do we figure out how many user groups, how many permission sets? How do we figure this all out, Kim?
Well, that's a great question. And I think one of the things over the years, I mean, you and I both have spent hours doing permissions. And I think one of the things that helped was when I kind of took a step back and, started looking at it from the perspective of, why should this be any different than anything else in the system? Why shouldn't we plan this out, And so sitting down and saying, okay, I have these user groups, I have these types of users, I have these permissions across the top, and saying, what does this look like? What should it look like for my organization? And I think it's amazing how many people just kind of don't plan it out during their implementation or during their upgrade, or maybe they're new to the system, they don't plan it out. And then what happens is on go live, everybody is super. Yeah. And I think this is really a critical thing to stop and really focus on, because it really is kind of the foundation for, getting this right to begin with. So, making sure you sit down, making sure you plan it. And then, the next step is also important. And what would that be, Cynthia? What would we do next?
Well, you actually have to figure out who's going to help you do that planning. Who are you going to deputize? Who are you going to bring into this project? This is not an IT project. This is not a management project. This is an organizational project. So you need to get representatives from each one of your organizational groups to be involved in this project. I'm not saying they're in every single meeting or you're spending hours and hours in the conference room, but they need to be involved, because you've got to get everyone's buy-in, because this is a project for the whole enterprise. You need to figure out who the user groups are. You might have one impression of who they should be, but you talk to a department head and you find out that it's completely wrong. And when you determine who your user groups are going to be, that gives you an idea of what permissions or permission sets you might need to create to meet the requirements of those user groups. And then we have the ability to use a tool in Business Central called the Recorder. And if you try to find it, you can't find it under that name. I'll show you where to get to it, to make that work easier. So you really need to get the whole organization on board that this is a project that you're going to take on. Now, I will tell you that anyone who rushes through the planning ends up having problems on execution. If you take your time in the planning and organization, execution is a lot easier. Now, why is that? Because we have a great tool available to us. Right now, I'm sitting on the permission set list page, and I'm going to create a brand new permission set for a user's role or job or activity, let's call it an activity, of working in the payment journal. So this is how minuscule these permission sets can be. It could be payment journal, create. You could have a permission set for vendor, create. So let's focus on the payment journal, create. When I create that permission set, it's got wide open permissions. So how am I going to narrow this down? Well, I get to use the recorder. And if you click on start, believe it or not, that's how you start the recorder. That's why you can't find it anywhere else. It's now recording. So I'm going to go right to the payment journal. I'm going to open the payment journal page. And now I'm going to do my work. And this is where these deputies come in handy, because that deputy is going to say, I prepare the payment journal by running suggest vendor payments. So you say, okay, let's run suggest vendor payments. What do you do next? Well, I kind of look at everything and it looks fine. So what I need to do now is I need to send a report to Susan for her to approve. So I run the vendor prepayment journal. Okay, well, let's run the vendor prepayment journal. All right, what else do you do? Well, let's see. I sometimes have to come in here and I have to go to the vendor. So I go to the vendor. And you can see how this person is doing their job. And what they're doing is they're coming in here and they're looking at terms because maybe they're trying to figure out why something didn't show up on here. They might need to go look at ledger entries. So you have this person who's doing their work with the payment journal do all of the things that they would do with the payment journal. Twofold here. One, I'm recording what it is they're doing, and here I'm deleting a line, but I'm also reviewing what they're doing. I might find they're doing something they shouldn't be doing. So I get kind of a little byproduct out of this process. When I'm all done, I go back to this permission set page and I stop the recorder. And now I get prompted, do I want to add the permissions that have been recorded? Now, we went in the payment journal, we went to the vendor, we went to ledger entries, we ran a report. So we'll probably get, what, like 5 things on here, right, Kim? Maybe 6? What do you think?
Oh, I think you'll get a little more than that.
Oh, just a little bit more.
Yeah.
Amazing. This is everything that the system touched or considered. Could you have figured this out on your own, Kim?
No, I mean, remember when we used to have to do this, and it was pretty much you assign one thing, somebody goes, tries it, they get an error, you add the next one, and you would spend hours doing this.
So we went to the journal line and it recorded permissions to the journal line. If I scroll down, you'll notice that you'll see suggest vendor payments. Well, guess what? That's a report. Gee, I would have thought that would have been a code unit. The vendor prepayment journal is also a report. So you can see here why this is so important to do. Now, if for some reason I have forgotten to do something, I can manually change whether it's the insert permissions or the read permissions. I can also start the recorder again and append to this set, because maybe the person says, oh, wait, there's something else that I do in that payment journal. Now, the fact that we didn't post means that post wasn't recorded. So right now, if I take away super or basic permissions and I assign this permission set, this user would be able to go as far as they did when they recorded, but if they tried to post, they would not be able to post because we did not record post. So you can see how this is very, what do I want to say, helpful in not only including everything that needs to be included, but excluding everything that needs to be excluded. So you use this process to record the employee permissions. Then you figure out how you want to group these. So this permission set would be added to my AP person. All right, but this permission set would not be added to another user group. So my AP user group would get this permission set, my AR user group would not. And then I need to make sure I assign the AP user group to my AP person and the AR user group to my AR person. Now, let's say that I start out with somebody who's an AP/AR person, and we get so big that we decide to hire, and now one person's going to do AP and another one's going to do AR. If I've created those individual permission sets based on activity, it's going to be really easy for me to break apart that user group and reassign those permission sets to two separate user groups. So you can see how laying the foundation for these activity-based permission sets really not only sets you up for success for today, but as your company grows. And the only way that you can make sure that everything is right is that you test, test, test. And I wish I could say test, test, and test some more, and I will, because that's really the best way that you can do it. You can do all of this in a sandbox, and there are tools available to export the user groups and the permission sets out of your sandbox and into production. So there are ways to handle that. And I think that's really important to understand. You have to test it out because you don't want to be in the situation where everyone hits a work stopping event the first day that you implement permissions.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a lot of great points there. One of the things that I think that I've seen too that makes it easier for auditors is when you do have those smaller permission sets. And one tip I will give too is to make sure you name the permission set something that makes sense, right? So
agreed.
You know how the old names for nav, it really can help that conversation with auditors if you do have the AP journal and the AR, you know, having those separate and having them be small, it makes that conversation so much easier.
And there are other tools also where you can go and you can look at user groups and see what users are in user groups. We do have some, I think, nice views to make managing that and presenting that to the auditors easier. And that information can be exported to Excel. So track changes. It's not just about permissions, right? I mentioned to you that we don't have field level security. So if I have to give someone access to the vendor, I can limit their access to bank accounts because it's a separate table. That one's kind of easy. But what if I have to give someone access to the bank account, our bank account, because they might have to change the last check number, right? Because it got shredded in the printer or whatever it might have been. So I need to give them access to the bank account card, but maybe there's some fields in there that I feel are sensitive or need to be tracked or monitored. We have some new functionality in our latest releases of Business Central, and it's called sensitive fields. And it's really in its infancy. We have ways to categorize the data to basically indicate what type of sensitivity it is, and we can also monitor certain fields. So the way that works is you can set up the email in Business Central. So you just got to make sure you get that set up first. And then you can use the monitor field change setup through assisted setup guide. And what that allows you to do is determine what of the standard sensitivity classifications you want to invoke in your Business Central. And from there, you can also go to field monitoring setup and say, of this type of field, what do I want to monitor? And by the way, you can actually add some of your own fields, not just the ones that are data or sensitivity classified, and you can monitor those. So in this case, what I might want to do is monitor not the last check number field, but monitor the bank account field, because that's the one I'm worried about them changing. I know they're going to go in and change the last check number, or maybe I don't know and I want to be known that. So maybe I'm going to monitor both the bank account and the last check number. Now what happens is, based on the way you set this up, you'll actually get an email telling you that that field has been changed. So it's a really cool feature. I would not recommend that you set this monitoring on tons of fields, but really those key fields that you need to be notified that someone has changed. Now, we also have retention policy that's newer, and what that does is it allows us, right now, I think it's only 3 tables that it can be applied to, but the idea there is you can say that after 6 months, you can go ahead and clear out records. I don't need to keep anything beyond 6 months. That's the minimum. After that, you could say 3 years, 2 years. You can't go to 3 months. It's if you set up a retention policy, 6 months is the minimum. So you have this ability to monitor certain fields, define retention policy. These are all newer features. Really cool, but again, in their infancy. So right now, this classifying data sensitivity feature, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about, because right now it's kind of a matter of convenience only. You'll notice that in the second bullet point. I haven't seen where it really integrates into a lot of areas in our system, but this is I want to say up and coming, but this has become more and more important as we start integrating our data into other realms. For example, Power BI, all this, exposing the O data and everything else. So I think that this is an answer to that. This is something that I'll be watching and trying to get a better understanding of. Retention policy, as I mentioned, the one thing I want to tell you about this is you have to have super user permissions and the retention policy setup permission set. The other thing that I've noticed, and Kim came to my rescue, is that we've done a better job now of splitting out what I call IT admin permission sets from the super user. So you can be a super user and not have all the IT admin like permissions that we've had in the past. You have to add those separately. So I was actually doing a training class and I deleted the user group on my user that allowed me to set permissions. So then I was kind of screwed. So I had to reach out to someone else in the organization that had the permissions that to change that for me, right? To put it back to my user. So you want to be careful when you're doing all of this stuff, is just to really pay attention to, if you can't see the functionality, it's probably because you don't have the right permissions, and you'll need to make sure that permission set is added to you. Thank you, Kim, for saving me that day, by the way.
You know what though, but I bet your students will never make that mistake, or they'll think twice, trust me. So, sometimes those things work out well. Yeah.
It did.
It's a good learning experience.
At the end of the class, we do the takeaways, right? And the IT administrator said, my takeaway is to make sure I don't delete that permission from my user. And I was like, well, good. I did that on purpose just for you. So,
exactly.
So Kim, why don't you talk about Changelog? It's been around for a while, but I think a lot of people misuse it.
Oh, definitely. No doubt about it. So I found, I've been at a lot of different places. I've seen a lot of different databases. I saw one database where they've had the changelog turned on for some tables since 2001. So if you can imagine how many records are in that changelog, it's crazy. So the big thing with the changelog, and I think just permissions and securities in general, is really, it also comes down to planning here, right? Yeah. What are the things that I really need to check and watch and to kind of be able to see if fraud has happened? And to your point, kind of talking about over the whole organization, I mean, it's easy to pick on accounting. It's easy to say, tell me when a vendor address has changed, or tell me when a bank account has changed. But, really sitting down and figuring out, is there somewhere else where there's an opportunity for fraud to happen? And I think that becomes an important conversation when you start talking about changelog. What am I going to track? Mm-hmm. And, you can set it on any table that you want that's in the database. And I would say don't set it on every table in the database, and don't set it on, if you can avoid it, do not set it on like the sales order table, the sales line table. Like, tracking the transactions at that level is crazy and will blow up your database in no time. Now, I have used it in the odd occasion where I've used it more as like a troubleshooting tool. So you turn it on, you troubleshoot the issue, you figure out who's changing something, and you turn it right back off. And I think that's where, that's where a lot of people forget to turn it back off. Yeah. But really, for me, the biggest use of it is making sure you're tracking those changes to the fields, and you can track like an insert, same as permissions, right? Tracking the insert, modify, delete, all of those things.
What if I just want to track a particular field in a record? Do I have to track the whole, like all the fields, or can I pick it field by field?
No, and that's a great point. That's exactly what you want to do. So like on the vendor, maybe I just want to track an address change. So I'm just tracking, I'm setting up address 1, address 2, city, state, zip, all of that. I'm tracking those 5 fields. Or on a bank account, like you said before, you could just track those 2 fields that you want to track, the last check number and the bank account number. And really definitely do that. Don't track all the fields in a table. Like, I know I had one customer where somebody was updating the cost on an item and causing some issues with, financially. So, making sure you're tracking just, the item table has 100 some fields. So just track the 2 fields you want to track. So,
right.
yeah.
But don't track unit cost if you're doing average cost.
No. Right. Exactly.
Every time that got updated.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Anything that's like transactional, you really want to be careful with. Anything that's going to have a recurring transaction, because I've seen people too where they're like, oh, my database, and this is more common in older versions, my database is really slow. Well, one of the things we always check is how much is turned on as tracking in the changelog. And I actually was at one place where they were tracking every insert, modify, and delete of a sales line.
Oh my gosh.
And it was crazy. So that's a little bit of low hanging fruit where we could turn that off, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, this thing is fast, So
now, one of the things that's interesting that I found is the monitor and the changelog, they're connected. So if you're monitoring a field, you can't pick it in the changelog. So you have to do one or the other. And it's a little bit, you get messages. It's not like you get blindsided by it, but it tells you, well, you can't do this in the changelog because you've got monitor fields turned on, on this table. So
and to your point, I would expect that what's going to happen, the changelog has always been kind of this thing that's unwieldy. It's hard to look at. It's hard to set up, the notification process. I would expect that what's going to happen is the field monitoring is really going to be that front end where you set up all that stuff. And the changelog is just executing that stuff in the back end. So I would bet, a couple waves from now, it might be interesting to see what that looks like.
Yeah, I'm hoping that there'll be better, maybe a reporting view. So monitor meaning, I want to report this or I want to be notified of this. You'd have the 2 different options maybe. I hope so, because I think it's an invaluable piece for audit purposes, because there are things that you need to know when have been changed. I think it's a shame that people are frightened by it because they hear the stories about performance being impacted, or they look at it and see how unwieldy it looks in demonstrations or whatever it might be. But if you use it properly in conjunction with permissions, because we've talked about that situation where you need to give somebody access, but you want to know if they've made a change, because maybe you don't want them to make a change and we don't have field level security. Using the 2 together really can help you meet those requirements of your auditor or any other regulations that you might be under. And we've talked about Sarbanes-Oxley, but there are other, the DEA, the FDA. I mean, there's all kinds of organizations that have, if you work in that field, what kind of data and security issues you might have. Somebody that I know and through one of the local user groups, they work with defense contractors. So they have very high security requirements and they know what they are. And it's not just internal fraud they're worried about, it's exposure, from the outside. So really it's a matter of looking at everything and figuring out, kind of goes back to that planning thing, and figuring out what you would need to do next. Now, we've talked about a lot here today. And right here, I've got a slide. I know that this is a video, so you can't really click on these, but you can reach out to us through the NewView Strategies website or to Kim and I directly, and we'll be glad to send the slide to you. It's got some general information and articles that are not Business Central related. They're just related to security and fraud prevention. And then there are articles and information in here through docs.microsoft that are related to implementing some of the stuff that we talked about today through Business Central. So, as far as NewView Strategies goes, Kim, do you want to share a little bit here?
Sure, just a little bit about us and a little bit about what we do and what we have out on our website right now. We do have a current state assessment. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, how am I doing related to everybody else? Everybody kind of wants to know, where do you kind of rank there? So we have some current state assessments that are pretty easy to take. You can answer some questions and find out how you're doing. Also, we want to help you grow your business. So one of the things that we do and specialize in is value-driven transformation. So, helping you get more out of the system you already own. And then custom training, that is something that we do quite a bit of. So helping you, again, kind of that whole theme of continuous improvement with your users. Helping them get more out of the system once they're trained on the new functionality in the system.
So Kim, I didn't hear you say sell licenses or sell ISVs or sell development. I mean, we're really focused on using what you already have, right? And maximizing that potential and working with your partner, because we're not a partner. So working with your partner, right?
Exactly. And we've all been there and done that. We've all been on the end user side of things. So we have all worked inside of businesses and, had to figure out ways to get more out of our system as well. So, we come with a lot of experience, many years of experience. I'm just going to leave it at that right now. So
that's enough. Thank you very much.
That's enough. Yeah, we'll go with that. And here you can see. Yeah, here you can see is our contact information. And we're always willing to talk about Nav or Business Central. We love talking about it. We love hearing what other people's problems are and helping them figure out a solution. So feel free to reach out to us. Here's our email, our Twitter, and our LinkedIn.
Great. Thanks, Kim. This was fun.